Welcome to the Imaginaries.
Welcome to the Imaginaries podcast, where we talk about all things imaginary.
All things.
Today, we are returning to our roots, which is to say we're going to focus this podcast on a specific work of science fiction or fantasy.
Mm-hmm.
And I say science fiction or fantasy because we're kind of not really sure whether we call this more science fiction or fantasy, and we don't know if we care. But today we're going to be talking about N.K. Jemisin's The Fifth Season. Specifically the fifth season. We will be talking about the second book in the trilogy, The Obelisk Gate, in a future podcast. And the third book in the trilogy actually doesn't come out until August of this year, 2017. So we will be talking about that at some point, but, 8 months hence or something.
8 months!
So,
oh my goodness. This takes me back to when
I know.
Hunger Games wasn't finished being written, and I threw books across rooms. That was very dramatic.
It's a long time. When I finished Obelisk Gate a few months ago, I was like, oh, it's not too long until the next one comes out, and it's a long time.
Well, in N.K. Jemisin's defense, N.K. Jemisin being the author of the fifth season, she is churning these books out faster than, say, Patrick Rothfuss or George R.R. Martin. And am I casting side-eye and shade at these people? Definitely, because I love reading good books, and so of course I want them to be out faster, and there to be more of them. So thank you, N.K. Jemisin, for not being a total stick in the mud.
Yeah, totally. I really am impressed that she committed to this, over the course of 3 years, release a trilogy, one book per year, August 2015, August 2016, August 2017. Mm-hmm. And I think she's right on track.
So far. I mean, there were some issues with the first book's release getting pushed back. And I don't know whether that was... I don't think that was her. I think it was more Amazon or her publisher. There is an explanation on her website that probably has gotten buried over because, it's been a while since then when the book became available. But that was the rumor out there on Goodreads, which is a reputable place to get your book rumors from. And actually, N.K. Jemisin is one of those authors you can interact with on Goodreads. She responds to questions on her books and posts updates. So she is a very socially engaged author, which I respect.
Yeah, and she also has a really awesome blog, which she updates every once in a while. You should definitely go check it out. She's written recently about winning the Hugo for the fifth season. You can find more about N.K. Jemisin, and you can read her blog posts, which we will post links to both on our site, www.imaginaries.us, and via our Twitter.
Imaginary underscore pod. Yeah! Look at that.
Yeah.
Us all sounding the same. Okay, so moving into the actual book itself, Tony, where do we begin describing what this book is?
Well, why don't we begin at the very beginning, which is the discovery of this book. Our discovery of this book. Because I have to say, I found this book randomly. I had read one other book by N.K. Jemisin, The 100,000 Kingdoms. I was in San Francisco at the wonderful science fiction and fantasy bookstore, Borderlands, and I was just sort of looking around, looking at the recommendations, seeing what authors I'd maybe read a book by or had heard of but hadn't read anything by. And I came across the fifth season, and I picked it up, I read the back, and I was like, I opened it up, I read the first few pages, and I was like, shit, she is amazing. And I was already impressed with N.K. Jemisin's writing from the 100,000 Kingdoms, and so I'd been wanting to read more of her, but this just was so good right from the start that I picked it up and I read it. It wasn't the same day because we were on vacation and I was doing other stuff, but I read it on the plane back, and then I read it in the next couple of days, and then immediately I recommended it to you.
And I went on a long treasure hunt trying to find physical copies of this book, and with my finely attuned sense towards the impending doom of all things that I know and love, I have been trying to purchase all of my books from semi-local independent bookstores. So I put in an order at my semi-local independent bookstore, which happens to be over an hour away in Missoula and is called Shakespeare and Company. I put in an order there. The proprietor was very interested. He'd heard of N.K. Jemisin before. He had not realized that she had won the Hugo, and when he did, he promptly put in an order for like multiple copies for the bookstore, and as well as for the sequel, which I also picked up at the same time. So it took about a month between you telling me to read these books and me finding physical copies of the books. And of course, my hold at the library for it came in the same day that the physical books arrived in Missoula. So I then ended up with a library copy and the Missoula copy. So I promptly fobbed off the library copy on a coworker, and then today on a library patron who I regularly give recommendations to. I turned her onto the Expanse series by James S.A. Corey recently, and she's now reading through the entire series faster than I ever could. So these books are addictive. And going back to that first line, I think that's a good place to start. The first line of this book is, let's start with the end of the world. Why don't we get it over with and move on to more interesting things? And that is, like, literally, perhaps the strongest first line I have read in the last 5 years of science fiction. And I think it's because we all feel the truth of that.
Oh, yeah.
In that so much science fiction, so much fantasy has to slog through so much boring stuff before it gets to what we really care about. And this book just goes straight for the jugular. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, and what I really, really love about N.K. Jemisin is that she's a wonderful writer. She has her craft. She makes excellent choices. We're going to talk about some of them in a lot of detail later in the podcast. But she's not just a great writer. She's a wonderful storyteller. This is a wonderful story. Everything I've read by her has a wonderful story, and she tells it well. And that is just so refreshing, because I feel like one of the things that I myself as a reader can get too wrapped up in is the writing itself and craft choices and what's being done and how it's being done, and pick it apart too much. To be able to appreciate the 5th season and the Obelisk Gate on that level, but then just to interact with this wonderful, wonderful story was such a treat as far as, my recent reading.
I agree with all of the above or the before. And I also have to say, as writers, we are trained to deconstruct before we are trained to construct. That's just the byproduct of academia. And when I read a book like the 5th season, sure, part of me is still operating on that level, the very well-trained academic level, but more of me was just simply enjoying the book. It's pretty clear that she conceived of the whole trilogy, which has yet to be completed, but she conceived of it all at once, and she conceived of it as a whole. And so the two books flow very nicely into each other. Every element of the first book as a standalone text flows nicely into the next. And there is structure, there is wordcraft, very, very good in both cases, but your attention is not being drawn to those things. You're not being told, bow down at the altar of my sentences, all ye who enter here. And it's very graceful. It's not messy, but it is casual and relaxed, the way that her structure plays out, the way that her sentences play out. There are times where her sentences are choppy, but at the same time, that serves a purpose too. So pretty much, I couldn't be happier with the book as a piece of art, in part because I was able to forget that it was a piece of art while I was going through and just enjoy it in a way I haven't enjoyed a science fiction text lately. So, yes, thank you, N.K. Jemisin. You are a godsend. So it's the basic overview. This woman goes on a journey. This young girl gets trained on how to be an origine, which is the term for those tectonically gifted people. And the young woman meets her mentor and is trained in some of the finer arts and policies and philosophies of this world in which they live. So that's the world. But, and I hope we get to talk about this some more later or now, is this our world in the future? ... question mark?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and one that I was gonna ask you if you didn't bring it up, but what do you think? Is this Earth?
I mean, that's not something that has happened in book 2. I can say that for sure. It's still like a question mark in book 2, at least at the point where I am.
Mm-hmm.
I think the implications are clear. I think that N.K. Jemisin is relying on us to make meaning of it ourselves, which is kind of par for the course for her. She doesn't tell us how things are. She allows us to gather the inferences and make them into meaning. And I think the signs are all there because, as you will learn as events unfold, there are physical parallels to our world as we know it that tie to the world before the Shattering, which was the first of the 5th seasons to go down in their historical record. So in the world in which N.K. Jemisin lays her story, there are 5th seasons. That's where the title of the book comes from. The 5th seasons are when enormous earth-shattering cataclysms happen and the whole world essentially falls into chaos. Animals and plants adapt because they've evolved to deal with these seasons over time, and they become crueler and meaner and more toxic and all of these things. And so surviving during a season is a really tenuous thing. Usually it's just a part of the one giant continent on which they live that is affected, but sometimes the whole continent goes dark from ashfall, from volcanoes, or whatever it is, whatever kind of cataclysm it is. So the beginning of the book is set in motion when one of these cataclysms happens. So the 5th season not only takes place during a 5th season, but the world itself is defined by the regular occurrence or irregular occurrence of these 5th seasons, the first of which was called the Shattering. And so that shattering was so profound and significant that it completely altered the entire world, the shape of the world, and that would be where the departure from our world takes place, presumably.
So, I don't quite want to phrase this as, is this book fantasy or is it science fiction? Because I think that's a terrible way to box it in. But I am interested in talking about what sorts of tropes from those two genres it might be playing with, how it really productively breaks the boundaries that sort of box those two in and away from each other. I keep seeing the 5th season categorized as fantasy. It's even on my copy's spine. This book is fantasy. It doesn't actually say this book is, it just says fantasy. But I think you could easily make an argument that this is science fiction. So
I
don't want to make that argument, though. I don't want to make that argument.
No, I mean,
I just
would
want
feel
to think
comfortable
about
calling
other
it
things.
science fantasy, but that's a bit of a cop-out because it assumes that we can just say those two things marry neatly and no boundaries are crossed. But I do think that this is a transgressive work in that it does violate, and sometimes violently, the boundaries of both of those genres that you mentioned, science fiction and fantasy. So, okay, what does it have that's sciencey? It has an origin story as a book that is firmly rooted in real world science, in that it is in some ways the imaginative stepchild of one of NASA's launch pad workshops. So she was in direct conversation with Phil Platt, one of the most respected science communicators out there in the world. She's basically been hanging out with scientists the whole time that she's writing this book, which is like totally rad, and yeah, I totally envy her to that too. But at the same time, it also has elements content-wise that are pretty sciencey, in that the terminology they use for their tectonic powers is pretty technical, and it's pretty straight up the sort of thing that you would talk about if you were, I'm assuming, a geologist on Earth today. So, like, the language is accessible for these origins, these tectonically gifted people, because, like, we understand how plates shift and layers of strata interlock and magma and lava. Like, we know these terms, they're familiar to us, but they are, the way that she uses them, technical and accurate to the science. So there's that. What elements of it are fantasy? Well, especially as you move later into the first book and start brushing up against the second one, the conversation about magic starts to develop. And magic is a term that's actually used in the text at one point or several points. And, other characters call it different things, and we can talk about whether it's really magic or not. But there's this thing which gives certain specially gifted origins, specially gifted powers to interact with obelisks. And we'll talk a little bit about obelisks later, but they are these giant sort of semi-real crystals floating in the sky, which everyone thought were completely useless and just ornamental, but it turns out they actually have some important powers to them. So yeah, there's definitely magic. There's like training montage scenes, for lack of a better term. There's the guardian, like literally they're called guardians. They're kind of like the protector caste in this world. There is a caste system that's common to both science fiction and fantasy genres to discuss the caste system. And race is considered something important and talked about often in these books, which is, I would say, more fantasy, but definitely crops up in science fiction as well. So those things are pretty mainstream. But I think it's transgressive on both counts because both science fiction and fantasy often privilege plot and like the cool factor. We've talked about MacGuffins, we've talked about novums. They often privilege the novum or the MacGuffin over characterization. And I think the 5th season throws that all to the wind and says, screw you, genre convention. I am about character. And that's the strength and the ingenuity of these books. They're magnificent character portraits. Really, really well, fully fleshed, dynamic, living, breathing characters that are interesting. Really, really interesting. So that's kind of where I fall, in that I think it's transgressive because it very clearly has a foot in the genre door, saying, I'm interested in playing off of these tropes, the trainee with special powers, the coming-of-age story, the travel narrative. Honestly, I'm more interested in developing Essun and these other characters into something radical and unusual. I don't know. What do you think?
So, I actually held off on talking about this book during our discussion of magical systems intentionally. The important thing is that I avoided talking about magic in these books because they were sort of transgressing that entire conversation. And I like that they did that, but I wanted to bring them in here and talk about it here. And what I wanted to talk about specifically is, how is magic still magic if you're thinking about it scientifically and trying to gather, or when you're trying to understand about the scientific nature of magic? And it's not what this book is about, because I think you're right, and it's not relying on novums or MacGuffins. But at the same time, it is a question that sort of suffuses the book, and that I found really interesting. Because, it's sort of treated, is sort of treated scientifically throughout, the way that orogeny is understood, the way that Alabaster explains later in, I think it's actually not in the 5th season, but in the Obelisk Gate, how magic is actually produced by the body. And all of that is super interesting. But, it's just, that treatment is so different than anything else I've ever read, and was so welcome as far as the perfect encapsulation of boundary crossing that this book does for me. That I agree with everything you said, but I just wanted to add that piece in.
No, I love that. I have to say, though, that there are times when N.K. Jemisin is trying to explain this notion of magic as a term and as something that can be scientifically framed in her world. And I'm like, whoa, I don't know if you really thought this through fully. I mean, she probably did, but the language isn't doing her justice in some places. And you're right that this is mostly a book 2 thing, so this will be something that we talk about again when the Obelisk Gate comes up for discussion in this podcast. However, it is worth noting that magic in the 5th season, as separate from orogeny, which is the practice of the origins, that they're two separate things. The orogeny is an innate gift that all origins have. Magic is something that only specific origins can detect. And it is tied to living organisms, but also to the stone eaters and to the obelisks in really interesting ways. So there's a lot of conversation about orogeny and magic as an innate skill. You can develop it even if you only have a little bit of the innate skill, but you can only go so far if you're not innately gifted. So Essun and her daughter Nasun and some of the other characters that you come across, Alabaster is one of them. Alabaster is Essun's mentor, or sort of mentor, sort of lover, sort of hate, love, hate. I don't know. It's really messy, their relationship. It's wonderful too. But he's trying to explain to her that she's innately gifted and other people aren't. By virtue of using the limited second person perspective, it doesn't feel like a weakness when she's really confused and it's messy, because he's really a terrible teacher, and that's explained multiple times in the book, that he can't explain things to other adults to save his life. But it is also received by us, the reader, messily and incompletely. And I'm hoping that it feels more complete by the end of the 3rd book, because that is one of the more interesting novums unleashed in this series. But it, as you said, it's not the main point. So magic is here. Magic is in the series. So is orogeny, which kind of feels like magic and operates like magic. Yeah, but instinctive magic. It's instinctive magic tied to specific heat transfer systems. So yeah, super, super interesting, super complicated.
So I want to return to something you just said about the language in this book. You mentioned it slightly. I want to mention it a little bit more, and what I want to pull out specifically are the terms by which folks tend to call the origins.
Yes.
Yeah, and I want to talk about that specifically because the word origin and the less polite word raga, which is also used to describe such folks, are so well put together as words coming from outside to describe someone who had no ability to actually shape what those words might be, but then who, over the course of the book, we see them used by different characters, repurposed by different characters, taken back by different characters. But what I really like is the word raga just sounds so raw and offensive to me, and I'd actually be really fascinated, and I know we've said this before, if we have any linguists who listen to this show, maybe you can tell us something about the actual construction, phonetic or otherwise, of words that are offensive and how raga might fit into that. And I think that works so well, but I also think origin works really well because it sounds kind of sciencey, you know, like you can get some roots out of that makes sense. You can recognize some things as a reader, but also it sounds sciencey in the way of like homosexual to me, where it's actually, you know, it's this offensiveness that's sort of hiding behind the guise of science. Like it's definitely not a word that one would own for oneself unless it was already in use, used against you, like, you know, something that you wanted to repurpose or wanted to take back. And so I just thought she did such a good job with that. And there's so much to say, so many good things to say about the language, but I wanted to mention that specifically.
Yeah, and like other writers I know have touched on this notion of repurposing negative slang terms in you know, empowering contexts, and you can go back and trace multiple parallel sort of examples in the history of the English language, specifically in North America. And I think the most commonly thought of ones include one that I'm not allowed to say, which is great. And then Yankee is a term that used to be incredibly derogatory and has since been reclaimed as a word of pride to describe a group of people. So yeah, you know, and I happen to identify with a word that my mother feels is deeply offensive, which is the word queer. She refuses to use the word queer because she thinks of it as a slur, whereas I, who am queer, think of it as strictly descriptive and accurate. So yeah, you know, these terms do float around, and I do think Jemisin does a phenomenal job in thinking about language and making language a thoughtful construction in her text without making it the point, or the point in a really annoying way. Like it comes up repeatedly, you know it's an interest of hers, but it's not distracting from the other important things going on in the book. I think one of the things we should state about this series is that it's a really richly textured world, and everything feels part of the whole. Everything feels well conceived and naturally placed, and just a part of the tapestry that is the tapestry of these 3 ongoing narratives taking place before this background that is really deep in and of itself. So the conversation about language is part of the background that's happening. That doesn't lessen its importance or its incredibleness, but it's part of making these characters interact with their world and engage with their world in a way that feels natural and normal. If you were someone in our world, our non-fantastical world, who happened to be gifted in some unusual way, you would struggle with language the same way that these people do. It feels great. It feels so well put together. It puts me to shame, honestly. Like, I read it and I weep a little bit. It is beautifully made, this whole book. So I honestly can't give it any higher praise. So we're going to move on to talking about some of the other cool things it does.
Yeah, let's talk about the relationships in this book.
Oh, yeah.
Because I think that they're very complex. There's a really wide range. You have everything from the relationship, putting air quotes around this, because it's very much present at the same time, or it's present even though we don't see the characters interact, but between Essen and her husband, between Essen and her daughter, to the relationship between an Origene and that Origene's guardian, which can be, at best, described as abusive, to later in the book when we see a loving polyamorous relationship between Essen and Alabaster and another Origene that they meet on an island, a pirate, by the way, a pirate Origene. I appreciated the depth that all of these relationships had. I appreciated the breadth of relationships that N.K. Jemisin gave to us in this book.
Sure.
What was your favorite? And by favorite, I mean, which one do you think was rendered most starkly and most, I don't know.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I get where you're headed. Yeah. Okay, so the first story you're introduced to is Essun's, and she is in a kind of relationship, like the relationship that defines her storyline is that of her and this stone eater child, for lack of a better term, whose name is Hoa. And so there you have a mother who has been a cruel mother in order to train her children in how to survive, who has lost her child to her husband, who has lost her children because one has been murdered by her husband, and then kind of takes into her care, for lack of a better term, this child who is not her child and who is not, in fact, even human. And so that relationship is really interesting, and it's not what I would call maternal, but it is rich. Then the story of the young woman, that young woman's name is Cyan, or at least that's how I was pronouncing it.
Cyanite.
Cyanite is her full name, and she goes by Cyan for a lot of it. And she is in a relationship pairing with Alabaster for part of it, and Alabaster crops up in Essun's story too. Alabaster is an incredibly powerful Origene. He's kind of a little bit rogue. He goes off and does his own thing, and the Origene body, the Fulcrum, which governs its Origines, sends Cyan along in order to conceive a child with them. It's part of their maintaining their bloodlines, essentially, and generating more Origines for their various purposes. She's in this relationship which is not romantic but is instructive, so he's kind of teaching her, but he's also kind of abusing her, and she is kind of arrogant and hostile. And she is the character who ends up in this polyamorous relationship with Alabaster and the pirate, which is great and wonderful and so unusual. And then the third character is Demaya, and she is the little girl. And her relationship pairing is with her primary relationship pairing, and every character has multiple relationships, but they each also have a primary, and her primary is with her guardian, who is like a guardian is actually, it's one of the use castes, which is kind of like a social guild in a sense, that is charged with protecting, guiding, advancing the studies of young origins, and essentially making sure they don't do anything stupid with their ridiculously powerful tectonic gifts. He comes and rescues her from a really problematic, semi-abusive home life as a child, but then he kind of breaks her too, in some ways physically, in some ways emotionally, in order to help her survive into adulthood, because growing up as an origin is incredibly dangerous and hard. And so he helps her survive, but he does it by breaking her. She loves him, but it's complicated. She also resents him a little bit more as she gets older, and he becomes a really dangerous but powerful influence on her life. And I have to say that their relationship is the one that probably I think about most when I think about relationships in this book, although I still think about Alabaster and Hoa a lot too. I don't know. I mean, they're all so good, but I have to say that living where I do in Montana, the sense of isolation and feeling at odds with your surroundings and desperately wanting like someone to come alongside and kind of rescue you from making some of the tough decisions, like I can really connect with the young Demaya in certain ways, because I'm not yet a middle-aged woman with a family, and so there's more of Demaya that I can get my teeth into. Although Cyan is also very interesting, but she is a character who resists readers. Like, she doesn't want to be soft and warm and welcoming as a character. So yeah, Demaya's innocent, but she's an innocent who is broken. And I think we can all empathize with that. Like, everyone, no matter where you are, like, at some point you wake up and you're like, oh shit, life is hard. And that's Demaya's story. Mm-hmm. Yeah. How about you?
So obviously my memory of what is strictly in the 5th season and not at all in the Obelisk Gate is not super great, which is to say, I really appreciate in the Obelisk Gate how we get more from Nessun's point of view, mm-hmm. specifically about her relationship with her mother. But I'm pretty sure that is all in Obelisk Gate. There's none of that here.
It is. I can verify that.
I also really appreciate the evolving relationship that Essun has when she reaches the underground comm, with the leaders of the comm, with a woman who she meets earlier in the story as a young woman herself, who she then runs into again, who is a scientist in the world, and who travels with her for a time, settles with her. And I won't say too much more there, just that one of the things that I think this book does really well is it shows you all kinds of relationships. I mentioned sort of that laundry list at the beginning, but as you were talking, I was thinking, and I was like, how much, like, because all of those relationships that I mentioned, with the exception of Essun and her daughter, were between a woman and a man, mm-hmm. Or a woman and multiple men. But what I appreciate about this book is that we have really complex relationships between women as well.
Oh, absolutely.
And that's something very notable.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there's never a sense that the relationships between, the only relationships that can be romantic even are between men and women. And so it's very, oh man, like I would just say that this is probably one of the most gender weird books that I've read, the fact that the relationships between the primary characters and their secondary characters in each storyline are, male and female, that just feels coincidental, like, I don't know, yin-yangy, but for a lot of the text you're exploring, like, Demaya's relationships with her female fellow students and young people, with her mother. Then you get in Cyan's story, you've got less of the women, but you have her kind of initial mentor in the Fulcrum who's sending her out into the world to meet Alabaster. And this woman is, I think her name's like Feldspar. She's essentially what Cyan could become if she stays in the Fulcrum, and that's an interesting relationship developing there. And then you have, in as you mentioned, in Essen's storyline, you have her meeting this traveling geomest whose name is Tonki, and you have her relationship with the head of the geode community whose name is Ika, and both of those women are important. Like, they're not just random side characters who show up in one scene and then that's it. Like, these are developed and rich relationships that continue without giving you any spoilers about people's fates. Like, they continue into the second book. And hopefully beyond. I haven't, of course, finished. But, yeah, I definitely agree. But in every other way, it's, like, very gender weird. Like, there are even various points in the first book where they talk about gender as this very fluid thing. And I just really appreciate that as someone who identifies as simultaneously both agender and female at times. I really appreciate that. So, yeah. But okay. That brings up another thought for me, which is, and I have to tread carefully here because I myself am, I've mentioned this before, I am glow in the dark white, but I really appreciate that here's a book by an author of color about characters of color. Like, pretty much every character here is a person of color, and they're very wonderfully realized characters, and it's in no way the defining feature of the book, I would say. It's just one of the many other wonderful things about this text, that both of those facts are true. But I cannot think of any other middle-aged women of color who are the primary characters in their science fiction text the way that Essun is in the 5th season. She is magical. I mean, can you think of others?
So I actually compiled a couple of lists of middle-aged women of color who are protagonists in science fiction or fantasy books, and then thinking just of middle-aged women who are protagonists in science fiction or fantasy books, as well as middle-aged women of color on screen in science fiction or fantasy.
That's a lot of lists. Okay, start
at
the top.
Well, it's 3 lists. So they're all, unfortunately, pretty short lists, which is really frustrating. The first one is the shortest of all. I could really only think of some of Octavia Butler's characters, and even then, they might skew a little younger than middle-aged. I was thinking of the 2 Parable books and Lilith's Brood as probably the closest to middle-aged, in part because the characters in those books age over the progression of the books.
That's what I was thinking with Lilith's Brood, yeah.
Yeah, and at the end of the Parables, we have the main character as an old woman, so, and that doesn't count directly, but other than Octavia Butler, I couldn't really think of anyone, which was disturbing. I could think of a few more books in science fiction and fantasy whose protagonists were middle-aged women, but not middle-aged women of color. The Dream Quest of Velvet Bow, which is a book that we're coming up on soon and we'll discuss in the podcast. Contact, both the book and the movie. Annihilation by Jeff Vandermeer. Ammonite by Nicola Griffith. Bellwether by Connie Willis. But again, not a whole lot of women of color. And what I noticed about all of these, they're all science fiction, first of all, with the exception of the Dream Quest of Velvet Bow. And including Velvet Bow, they tend to all be scientists or mathematicians. Now, I think that's something that we tend to find in science fiction anyway. There's just a predisposition for characters to either be sort of like, you know, laser pistol wielding heroes or scientists. That's just sort of a convention of the genre. But one of the reasons why the fifth season stands out is that Essen is not really, first of all, not defined by her job in the same way that I think some of those other characters are, but also not easy to pin down according to her job. Like, the entire world is so different, there is no analog really for what she does, or at least not how I think about it. I think it's approachable, and I don't mean to throw that out there as a criticism. I like it a lot. I like that when I think of Essen, I don't immediately think scientist or teacher or traveler. Like, what she does, who she is more complex than that. Which is, again, not to say any of those books that I just named have non-complex protagonists. I love all of those books. That's why I thought of them. That's why I wanted to mention them. But that stands. So,
and we're planning on talking about Annihilation, Jeff Vandermeer's Southern Reach trilogy, next podcast, correct?
Correct.
Awesome. Okay, so what was your next list?
So my third and final list is women of color, middle-aged, protagonists, or at least main characters, on screen in science fiction or fantasy movies or TV shows.
And I think of Zoe, is it Zoe Burns? I always forget, in Firefly.
Washburn.
Zoe Washburn in Firefly. That is the
Played
only character
by the incomparable Gina Torres.
Oh, man. Who has continued to rate stellar shows on television. However, she is now a high-powered lawyer in Suits, and that's kind of what I know her from, which is not science fiction. So, I need her back in my sci-fi. But who else?
So Star Trek has a pretty decent track record of women in color in important and visible roles. Obviously, we have Nichelle Nichols from the original series playing Lieutenant Uhura. Not over 40 at the time. By the way, I should say, before we go any further, that I'm defining just as, a set of ridiculous boundary constraints. Middle age, somewhere between about 40 and 60.
Which is roughly, 40 is the age that Essun is when she begins her story in the 5th season. So it's not completely arbitrary, but the association of her age with middle-aged is arbitrary.
Right. So Nichelle Nichols, definitely not middle-aged when Star Trek the original series was on the air, but then continued to play Uhura through the 80s and the 90s in the movie series. And so we saw the character age, we saw Nichelle Nichols age. So Uhura definitely was a character who grew up on screen. Also in Star Trek, we have Alfre Woodard, who was in Star Trek First Contact. And again, I don't think she was over 40 at that point, but she also just popped up in the Marvel Universe in a role in the most recent Captain America movie. I think she's phenomenal, and I'm glad she's still getting work.
Wait,
so it's good to see her.
Which was the most recent one? I'm pretty sure I might have slept through
Civil
a bunch of Marvel
War.
movies. Civil War? Was that
Civil War.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's the one she was in. I don't know if it's most recent anymore.
Okay.
But obviously, we also we obviously have Whoopi Goldberg in Star Trek: The Next Generation, and the first two. No, sorry, not the first two movies. The first movie and the last movie of the Next Generation feature films. Who is just. If
Marvelous.
You don't like Guinan, I don't like you. That is all I'm going to say about that. We also had Roxanne Dawson on Star Trek Voyager playing Lieutenant B'Elanna Torres. So not only was the actress of color, the character was also of color, which is something that I think, and I mentioned that specifically because that's not going to be true for a couple of actresses and characters on this list. So we have some others in Star Trek. I was thinking of Penny Johnson-Gerald on Deep Space Nine, but she was not 40, I believe, at any time when Deep Space Nine was filming. So again, kind of sticking to my boundary condition there. So anyway, gonna leave Trek behind. Gonna jump, or rather, sorry, not gonna leave Trek behind just yet. We've had more casting for Star Trek Discovery, the new Star Trek series. which is, as of right now, maybe coming to TV sometime, maybe? But we do have a main character who is a woman of color, younger, not middle-aged, but we also have Michelle Yeoh playing the captain, which is wonderful. So I'm excited to see that. So anyway, now let's jump into something that is currently being shown, a current TV show. The Expanse, which we have yet to talk about.
Shohreh Aghdashloo. Oh my goodness. Best voice ever. I could listen to her read the dictionary, and in fact, I just discovered that she has read 3 audiobooks, so you can be sure I will be listening to those sometime soon.
Yes, totally. And she just, she's a phenomenal actress too. Like, not just the voice, like the acting power behind the voice is wonderful.
She has gravity. She has like real gravity for an actress.
Yeah. So I was thinking, and I know a book that you really like and a movie that you really like and turned me on to, Cloud Atlas. Halle Berry plays the main character.
Oh, she doesn't seem middle-aged though. I don't know why, but she seems like timeless, and she's always timeless to me. Of course, I never summed up the courage to see Catwoman, which probably would have affected my judgment of her.
Yeah. She is also, or was also, in the X-Men franchise.
Correct.
Up through
Storm.
The most recent, I believe the most recent movie, Days of Future Past. No, it's not the most recent movie anymore. There was a new one.
Is there?
Well, never mind.
You could tell we're really... Marvel needs to stop making movies, because I can't keep track of them anymore. There's a lot. Because you've got the Guardians series, you've got the X-Men reboot, and you've got the Avengers, and they're all individually, like, I could possibly hang on to one at a time, but I am too damn busy to watch all these Marvel movies. Save me.
I also want to give a shout out to Viola Davis in Ender's Game, because Major Anderson in that book is, as far as we know, a white dude. So the fact that they actually fleshed out that part and it went to a woman of color, awesome, wonderful choice.
Definitely.
I also, Ming-Na on Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. and on Stargate Universe. I've been a fan of Ming-Na since Mulan, since before she was in Mulan, since she was on ER in the very first season, and then came back and was a regular, and I'm like so happy that Ming-Na is still getting work, because I am just so much a Ming-Na fan.
Yeah.
And so the remainder of the folks on this list, and there aren't that many, which again is something I'm not pleased with, but I'm glad that there were as many as there were, but I was thinking of fantasy sci-fi animated shows. Women of color playing characters, maybe of color, maybe not. So we have folks like Aisha Tyler on Archer. We have Lauren Tom on Futurama. Dee Dee Magno-Hall on Steven Universe. And so, to varying degrees, we have different representations. On Steven Universe, Pearl, the character that Dee Dee Magno-Hall voices, is an alien. So that's, a little bit of a question mark. On Futurama, Lauren Tom does voice a woman of color, which is awesome. But that's about where my list ends.
And
unless you can think of anyone to add to it.
It's deeply problematic if we say, like, yeah, it's okay if women of color are playing aliens, because that's pretty much, like, just the distillation of the capital O other. And that's what we've made women of color in cinema for so long. Oh, it's like a perfect fit for them to play I find that deeply problematic when the only animated roles for women of color are alien.
Well, I was also thinking in the Star Wars universe, who existed there?
Star Wars has not been the province of diversity until recently. I have to say, with The Force Awakens, Disney took Star Wars in a direction that was deeply gratifying and pleasing to me, which is it diversified its cast. It brought questions of gender and sexuality into play. It's all around, they made some very smart decisions, and they did it without sacrificing all of the fun and rollicking good times that we had in the original series. So Star Wars is not very diverse. I have to say, even perhaps my favorite sci-fi television show of all time, until The Expanse, Battlestar Galactica, has a relatively diverse cast for its time, but if it was being shot today, I think it probably would be even more diverse than it was. That's my theory, and I'm sticking to it, because there are characters of color. There's even several women of color on the cast that are pretty important characters there. Yeah, but like, could we do better? Yes, definitely. And is N.K. Jemisin doing better? Yes, definitely. So
she certainly is.
It is my deep and abiding hope that we get the 5th season adapted to the screen at some point, and that they don't do that they don't pull a Halle Berry in Cloud Atlas and have one actress play all the different ages.
Yeah, that would be...
It would be my hope that they would have a middle-aged woman of color actress playing Essun, and all of these other characters would be their own characters throughout time. So yeah, it's that would be my hope and dream. So N.K. Jemisin, if you're listening to this, and if you have even a mote of control over what happens to adaptations of your work,
I'm pretty happy with everything that we've talked about today. How are you feeling?
I'm pretty happy about everything N.K. Jemisin has done, is doing, will ever do.
Yeah,
so
I am too.
I think that's a good place to end the podcast, on the note that we will be returning to the 5th season series, which is not called the 5th season series. It's called the Broken Earth series. We'll be returning to that. In the future, of course, we have quite a few interesting works to get through. We need to discuss Annihilation and the Southern Reach trilogy, which will be happening next. We've got Hidden Figures coming up. We've got Octavia Butler coming up. Honestly, we have a giant list, and so every podcast is going to be great. We're going to get back to the 7 beauties of science fiction in the future. Yeah, there's a lot going on. Where can they find us, Tony?
They can find us at our website, which is at www.imaginaries.us. You can also follow us on Twitter. We are imaginary_pod. Keep a lookout for us. We're posting a lot. You can also now find our back episodes on YouTube. We've linked them all through both Twitter and our website, so they're very accessible. But you can listen to our newest stuff, including this podcast, theoretically. It will also be up on YouTube, I'm sure.
It will.
We're on iTunes and we're on SoundCloud as The Imaginaries. Search for us in either place, follow us, do whatever those platforms allow you to do to let us know.
You can also drop us a line at imaginarypod, one word, @gmail.com. So
definitely do check out the 5th season. If there's one book that makes it on to your list that we have recommended on this podcast, I would say it should be the 5th season. Peace out.